Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, yesterday's FOMC was nothing more than kabuki theater and a big nothing burger, as it failed to address the real elephant in the room, and that is that the U.S. banking and financial systems are in a dire liquidity crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we thought it was a sort of good point to discuss this today in light of what's happened at the FMOC with the Fed cutting interest rates predictably by 25 basis points with promises of other cuts coming before the end of the year. But we're not going to focus initially on that. More focus on why there are serious concerns about structural problems inside the financial system, inside the banking system. And one thing I think it's worth mentioning, even though it's been mentioned before by us and certainly other people as well, is the whole issue of the rejection of the US dollar, US Treasury complex, and the increasing adoption of gold as a reserve asset. That is undoubtedly putting enormous strain on the US financial system, on US financial institutions in the process of doing this. There is absolutely no doubt as well that when we'd had zero interest rate policy for over a decade, that suddenly hiking interest rates should have absolutely irrefutably blown up the ginormous interest rate swaps market, which mysteriously it didn't, and questions need to be asked as to, well, why hasn't it still blown up? And okay, I know they're starting to cut interest rates, but again, that raises another serious question as to what is going on, not just in derivatives, but in this case specifically the interest rate swaps market, which quite a few of the too big to fail banks in inverted commas have enormous exposure to. So that's another problem. Then I think another problem worth mentioning is undoubtedly the enormous non-performing loans that will now exist across the entire banking system. I think arguably there are huge amounts that are in really essentially in default. That's a huge problem. The other thing, of course, is the problem with financialization is all these bloated assets, which have valuations way in excess of where they should be, and of course there are some very peculiar prices attributed to a whole bunch of assets, and they again are indicative of the fact that you may now have a situation, undoubtedly in financial institutions and even too big to fail banks, where in essence they're technically in default. And there always comes a tipping point in this regard. So for me, there's some just very broad issues that are ongoing and outstanding. They're not totally all the problems because there's all exposure to private equity, there's exposure to commercial real estate, retail real estate, and all the debt that's swilling around the entire financial system, whether that relates to the likes of you and I, retail or commercial or sovereign, etc. But the one thing that's been brewing for quite a considerable period of time, and that relates to the reverse repo markets, because if you go back at one time, financial institutions, including banks, were parking about 2.5 trillion, I think was the peak, if I remember correctly. Now, basically, it's, September 2025. Those financial institutions are parking essentially nothing at the Fed anymore. So the question is, what happened to the $2.5 trillion of apparently excess liquidity? Well, there are people who will say, oh, but they just parked it somewhere else in money market funds, or it's parked here. Well, there's no actual evidence that categorically proves that to be the case. Just because money is in appears in a Western financial system, be extremely cautious as to what that might mean in reality, and we won't say any more than that. But I think very clearly there is undoubted evidence that financial institutions are now basically suffering from a liquidity crisis because they don't have all that excess capital, all that capital that allows them to be able to withstand a liquidity crisis. And note there has been tried to be big moves by the Trump administration to relax the rules with regards to capital buffers. Now, you wouldn't do that unless the financial institutions are struggling and can't maintain those capital buffers, which again implies liquidity issues. So these are all things that are ongoing and are factually correct and support the very obvious view that there is a liquidity crisis and in the financial system, and when and if it becomes something that isn't manageable, isn't containable, it's not going to happen gradually. It will happen very suddenly, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen today or tomorrow or next week. I'm not inferring that kind of imminency, but I think we should be something we need to be thinking about. And we're kind of always in that window, September, October, where financial surprises do happen.
Yeah, putting a number of pieces together, and obviously it's impossible to say on this exact date, but in late 2022, we had the dollar and the DXY pretty much hit its high of about 113 that we've seen over the past decade. Ever since then, it has been in uh, at certain points sharp decline, and then maybe stagnation, and then inevitably it has gone since that time, since about this late 2022 to the start 2023 to now, which is 2.5 years. We're talking from 113 down to 96, and it's moved up the last 2 days. We discount that. At the very same time, the reverse repo hit its peak in 2020, in late 2022, right about the same time, and has been in subsequent decline over that period of time. So we've seen the liquidity of the banks go down sharply over those 2 years. Let's not forget in 2023, we had the Silicon Valley Bank fiasco and liquidity crisis. That was something they had to deal with. But when you also take a look, go to gold, and gold has started its climb at exactly the end of 2022 to what it is now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The movement in gold can be attributed to many factors, including, of course, the concerns about Trump's tariff policy or Trump's policies, full stop, the US economy or Western economies, but also the Western financial system. And it's entirely possible that there are going to be institutions, high net worth individuals, sovereign nations who could be privy to the notion as well of a liquidity crisis, a major financial event, or the risk of it, and therefore lining their ducks up accordingly to buy huge amounts of gold, which is why we've seen this big, huge spike in gold prices. If you go back to literally almost 10 days, 12 days or so, it'll be 2 years. Gold price is more than doubled. It's gone from just over 1,800 an ounce to, well, the last I looked, 36, whatever. So it's more than double, basically. So that is another indication that there are institutions, individuals who are equally mindful that there are many factors why uh, holding precious metals is something they want to go, or holding gold is something they consider to be a necessity rather than a luxury. And we continue to see Western countries buying gold. Poland's a great example of that. Hungary has, the Czech Republic has, just to name a few. So Western European nations, and the US, of course, don't. I mean, because they're never going to do that, no matter what happens. But again, that's another indication of concerns, not just about the economy, but also structural concerns about the plumbing of the Western financial system. And therefore, on that basis, I think we then have to start to assess logically at what point, and we continue with literally nothing being parked at the Fed in a reverse repo, can we say with a reasonable degree of confidence that there is certainly at the very least a risk of another repo crisis, meaning interbank lending becomes a huge problem? And I think the answer is absolutely yes now. Does that mean it will happen? Well, not necessarily, but there is a serious risk that it could happen. And I think on the basis of all these factors, there is more to the idea of the Trump administration wanting to slash interest rates. And there is no doubt, of course, that they want to see interest rates a lot lower because they have to roll over all this debt. And the lower the interest rate, the lower the interest payments are on that debt. But let's be honest, there was talk at the start of the Trump administration of Doge, we're going to cut all this government spending, we're going to make government lean. And government spending continues to go through the roof. So there's no indication that the Trump administration is going to cut government spending. So you can slash interest rates, but okay, and because of the nature of debt, depends if it's on the long end or the short end. Well, you might be able to keep feeding the short end, and therefore you can start to cut interest payments to some degree. But equally, the flip side to this is if you're just going to spend like there's no tomorrow, which they look exactly like they're going to do, then of course those interest payments are going to stay extremely high, and they're not going to in any way, shape or form reduce as dramatically as they would like everyone to believe. And I think they genuinely think this is a reality. So what are the reasons would they want to slash interest rates? Well, again, if you slash interest rates, it might help to alleviate problems in the interest rate swap markets. It will help to alleviate businesses who are heavily indebted, but whether they can roll over their debt is an entirely different matter, or restructure their debt, should I say. So that's a debatable question, but if there is stresses and strains inside the financial system, it would be better to have lower interest rates than higher interest rates, clearly. And that relates to also all the debt, that because the West constantly depends on endless credit. So hence why we had zero interest rate policy for as long as we did. But another point with regards to this is, okay, what is the outcome of slashing interest rates? It might be, well, we can do something to the economy. We can try and manage the debt better. We can avoid some crises in the financial system, which we don't want to admit to, but this is a way we can handle it better. And because ultimately, this is what's going to happen with the Trump administration's policy decisions. It's very clear they want to slash interest rates. They don't care about inflation. Inflation could go to whatever it's going to go to, and you have to factor in what tariffs will do to inflation with producer price inflation, etc. I mean, inflation could be running at 6, 7, 8%. They're going to run it at that. They are going to obviously slash interest rates. They're going to spend like there's no tomorrow, so the budget deficit's going to increase. They're going to therefore also then say, well, it can't have inflation running at 6, 8% and do nothing about the yield curve. So we'll have to have yield curve manipulation or yield curve control, which means the Fed's going to have to step in and start printing money like there's no tomorrow. Well, if you anticipate problems in the financial system, that's a very convenient time to start plugging gaps because you're going to be printing money like there's no tomorrow. I mean, basically they think they can defy the laws of everything. Gravity, the laws of basic maths, the laws of basic finance. You cannot do all these things and not end up in the situation where you're going to completely destroy the dollar and you're going to end up printing like there's no tomorrow. So you'll end up printing, who knows, 10, 20, 30, I don't know, trillion dollars. And they somehow think they can get away with this. They genuinely believe this is a solution. This is not controlled demolition, as people seem to think. They're not trying to blow anything up, they're trying to save it, but not realizing it would have been far better to try and let the air out of these asset bubbles, which is this is only going to increase the air in these asset bubbles. It's going to resolve nothing. And in the end, they're just going, but then the excuse will be, well, we could just print trillions and plug some hole here and plug some problem here. And somehow magically it'll all work out and inflation will disappear. And the budget deficit will magically disappear because remember, we're going to grow the economy because we're going to finance it with what? And nothing. They're not going to grow the economy because in how the economy really needs to be grown because they're incapable of doing that and they're not going to be able to have this big industrial renaissance in America for the reasons we discussed previously, but principally because the cost of living matrix in the United States is far too high. They can never be competitive. So in the end, they're just going to sit there and go, well, we'll just have to keep the wheels on this going and we'll have to keep the system ticking over. So they know the choice in the end is just printing like you would never believe until they destroy everything. And in the process, this could be partly also why there's this big push. Let's slash interest rates. Let's start to have a system where we can go with zero interest rate policy again at some point, and we can have endless money printing. Because if there's another repo crisis, who's going to resolve that? The Fed's going to resolve. They're going to have to step in. They have to step in and put out all the fires everywhere. And hence why you don't want interest rates at 4 or 5% if you have to do that.
There's about three or four things here that I'm looking at that really stand out to what is leading up to this. First off, is that the dollar, while it has had a disconnect as its petrodollar status, the reality is that more and more, especially over the last uh, 3 to 5 years, more and more oil is being sold in currencies other than the dollar. India is buying it from Russia with rupees. China is buying it from Russia with yuan. Iran is outside the SWIFT system where oil is being distributed. So a lot of the quote unquote dollars that would have been part of the global financial system and monetary system are no longer in use. Counter that also with the rise of BRICS, the SCO, where more and more nations are doing trade in their own currencies. So a lot of the liquidity that used to flow into New York is no longer being flowed. And then couple that with the fact that capital is leaving the United States in massive amounts to be invested in China, India, emerging markets, and the like. And the final thing, and this is, I haven't really delved much into it, but it has to have some sort of correlation. And that is when President Trump decided to do this tariff policy. How much is it being affected by something known as Triffin's paradox? Now, for those who don't know, Triffin's paradox was something that came out of the Bretton Woods, where we had a singular reserve currency. And Triffin deduced that if you are the unipolar reserve currency, then you cannot have a trade surplus. You must always have a trade deficit. Because if you don't, then all the dollars will remain in your banks and not spread out throughout the world. And if you're the reserve currency, the world desperately needs dollars to be able to buy oil and other commodities and such. So you have to continuously have that trade deficit getting cheap goods while the world gets your dollars. That has been in decline, especially since about 2014. Well, by doing the tariffs and Trump's philosophy of we can be the reserve currency and have trade surpluses, and we're going to do so by these tariffs, he's sort of trying to go against what at least has been proven to be an economic law. And inevitably, by those tariffs bringing more dollars back, the world has a liquidity shortage of dollars. And so, what are they doing? They're looking for alternatives. They're seeing that the dollars are no longer being available, so we're going to trade in other currencies. We're going to buy gold. We're going to find some other alternative. And now the United States is sitting here going, uh-oh, we don't produce anything and nobody wants our dollars. What are we going to do?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, the other point is that they are also reject because they're rejecting the dollar more than anything. They don't want to trade in it, so therefore they're making a conscious choice to extricate themselves from dollar-denominated assets and dollar-denominated debt, etc., etc. So, in the end, there are many facets to what the Trump administration is doing, and there is no doubt that they think that somehow they can deal with all the woes, all the problems by making a policy decision that or policy decisions that ultimately is only going to destroy the dollar in totality if they carry on doing what they're trying to do, because in essence, they're just going to create a Weimar Germany scenario and I use the scenario, let's not say absolutely like for like, but they're going to end up creating that scenario in the United States. And there might be an argument, of course, in all this that they're hoping in the process that the world will be desperate for more dollars, so they'll all want to jump back on the dollar gravy train, which of course they're not going to, because they're going to look at the US and go, but you're destroying your own currency, you're destroying your own economy and your financial system. We don't want anything to do with it, and hence why the big rush to get out of the Western financial system, out of the dollar, out of SWIFT, and embracing a new world where countries can trade with each other and have immunity from whatever is going on in the West, more or less to which might seem unbelievable, but people don't realize when we had the 2008 financial crisis, well, Western financial crisis, it didn't affect China at all. Why did it not affect China? Well, okay, China obviously was trading in dollars but with the world, but China had a closed financial system. Its country was immune from the problems that were going on elsewhere in the world. It had limited exposure to it. That's a valuable lesson that countries around the world are now learning, that if we get out of that system and minimize the risk, yeah, there is going to be some problems. We can't be totally immune from it, but it will go a long way to creating far more stability. So we need to get out of that as fast as possible because we see it as a sinking ship as well.
Yeah, and one final thing to note, you can have a massive amount of a given currency within reach and still have liquidity problems. Take a look at what we have in the United States today. The debt to GDP ratio is upwards of about 125 to 130%. That means that for every dollar printed, it has diminishing returns and diminishing value in its use. So when you have diminishing value, diminishing returns, and of course lower purchasing power, it doesn't matter how many quote unquote dollars you have available. Its ability to be used and support a margin-based system, there's just never going to be enough dollars, aka the signs, more and more signs of liquidity problems. Paul, are there any other final things you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that's a good point. There's some enough to chew on in there that's not everything discussed, but we don't want to make these discussions too long because People just don't want to listen for 3 hours. But I think there's enough in there to give people food for thought in terms of what we're saying and why this is a legitimate problem that is widely not being discussed.
Absolutely. And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you, as always, for your support. Obviously, as well, put your opinions and thoughts in the comments. We'd love to see them and inner discussions amongst the listeners of the channel. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment. Send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.